Welcome back to Wired to Play, where brain science meets everyday classroom practice. I'm Dr. Christie McPeck, and I'm here with Executive Director Jeni Gonzalez.
Hello.
And last episode, we talked about where brain science meets everyday classroom practice. So today, we're going to be answering the next big question, which is, what does this actually look like in a real classroom? Because understanding brain development is powerful, but it only matters if it changes what we do with children every single day. This episode is all about real, practical strategies that you can use in a classroom. And today we'll be focused on kindergarten through third grade. How do we teach literacy, math, science, and social emotional skills while honoring how young children's brains develop? So we're moving from theory into practice. But first, we're going to answer some questions from last week's episode.
Great. Let's go ahead and start our questions. First question. Dear Wired to Play, this is from Kelly. How have you seen hands-on, play-based learning impact a child's ability to understand and remember concepts compared to traditional worksheet-based instruction?
One of the things that we really look at in a play-based classroom is how do we translate those academic skills into play-based activities that reinforce the concepts that we're trying to teach. And so we see that all the time, I think, in hands-on play. We see children working with, say, money. They're learning money. So they learn to count out money. They learn the value of something, and that helps them understand the value of each piece of money. Or when they're playing blocks, we're trying to teach concepts, geometry concepts. And so we give them blocks and they learn. We can see a lot of learning, right? And if we give the child a triangular block and we ask them to build something, and they try and put the square flat block on the top of a triangular block, what happens? It falls off. It falls off. So
no support.
Right. So then they go, oh, okay, I get it. That doesn't work. And they try something different. Maybe they try 2 blocks on the edge. And they're not only do they get the learning, they get the concept without us having to tell them that. You can't balance a rectangular block on a triangle block. We don't have to tell them that. They discover it for themselves. So that's what we see in a classroom. We see them getting to actually conceptualize the ideas that we're sharing with them, the things that we want to teach them in this hands-on way. And then we know from the brain science that makes the strong connection with their neuron, right? The synapse really gets formed strongly because they're not just being told that. They're not just looking at a picture on a handout. They're actually getting to figure that out. Think of how different it would be if you just gave them a handout that had a triangle and a rectangle and you said, could that balance on it? Most kids wouldn't even be able to conceptualize that if they hadn't had any experience playing with blocks. So the experience with the blocks gives them the concept to be able to learn and reinforce that.
You know what? Correct. Let me give you an example. We have an activity in one of our younger threes class, and because we're discussing like growing, planting, and the teacher made flower pots, and then she made little flowers, and on the flower pot there's dots with the number, and then the flower stick that has the dots. And I'm sitting there yesterday, I'm watching the kids, and I'm watching the kids count the dots, and then looking at the stem of that flower and counting, and then looking to see, can I match the dots, which is their number, they're recognizing the numbers. And not a worksheet, just counting and seeing the child have that aha moment again of identifying that's number 4, here's number 4, it matches.
Right.
So, that's a great hands-on that the child got to experience and not on a worksheet.
We're going to talk about that some today in our episode. Some of the different kinds of activities we can give for that very thing. When we're talking about math concepts, we need to give them to kids in concrete ways. These are concrete operational learners, or pre-operational learners, concrete operational learners. They both need hands-on concepts to be able to construct that knowledge. We can't just talk to them about the symbols. Yes. The symbols aren't meaningful. And so I hope that answered the viewer's question.
Yes, I think so. And our next one from Melissa. Dear Wired to Play, How can schools balance academic standards with developmentally appropriate practices, especially in kindergarten through third grade?
I think it's a fable to say that play-based education doesn't hit academic concepts. That's something that we need to, that's part of the reason we wanted to do this podcast, right? We wanted parents and teachers to understand that we do a lot of academics in play-based education, and that it's the better way to teach 0 to 8. It's the better way for them to understand. So when we are looking at balancing academics and play-based things, play-based activities, one of the things that we really want to, it's a fallacy to me. I don't think it is a balance. I think that the play-based activities teach the academic concepts. And the idea that if you're play-based, you're not academic, and you're only academic if you're doing things on a handout is just wrong. I think it's just a wrong idea. We need to help people understand that play-based activities are the way to teach academic concepts from 0 to 8. So even through those kindergarten through third grade, we still need to be giving them concrete examples of the concepts we're trying to teach them. And that's how we get the balance, so to speak.
Got it. Well, those are our questions today, and I want to thank our audience for sending those in. So thank you again, Kelly and Melissa, for sending that in. And hopefully we'll be getting some new questions at the end of this podcast.
Remember, if you have questions, you can send them to wiredtoplay@Zay Productions. Thanks for your questions.
Now let's get into today's episode.
So today in our episode, we want to talk about some practical ways to get hands-on learning in a classroom. And today we're going to focus on kindergarten through third grade. Later, in some later episodes, we'll shift down to preschool. But today I really would like to talk about kindergarten through third grade, because that's the area where I think people think play isn't necessary anymore. So what are we talking about when we talk about hands-on learning? What does that really mean? It doesn't mean chaos. People think it means chaos. Doesn't mean chaos. It doesn't mean lowering expectations. It doesn't mean we're not going to learn things. We're not going to teach again academic skills. We believe in academic skills. We know what kids need. We know how to scaffold them, right? To start at the foundation, like we talked about a couple episodes ago. And it definitely doesn't mean a lack of structure. I think sometimes people think play-based means that the kids just get to go wild and do whatever they want. And that's not the case either. We set up an environment where we have specific goals and objectives of what we want the academics to be, what we want them to learn. And then we set out to give them ways to investigate that learning. In these classrooms, children learn by doing, by discussing, and reflecting. And that's a really important component that I think sometimes missed. We're not saying we should get rid of all paper and pencil activities. We're not saying we should get rid of the idea of academics. What we're saying is that we should set up environments where children get to do, they get to have hands-on concrete experiences, and then they get to discuss them and reflect on them. In this sense, teachers act as guides, right? They act as observers. They make sure that the children are moving along in the concepts, and they're there to step in to maybe explain a concept. Or if children are watching an ant farm, they talk about how is it that ants work, and they give them additional information that the child might not know. So it's really important that the teachers understand they're not just deliverers of information. A lot of times in traditional classroom models, we see ourselves as deliverers of information. We stand at the front of the classroom and we just give you the information, and children just are supposed to suck that in. That does not help them construct their knowledge. We need them to be able to construct their knowledge. And we want to give them academic standards. We believe in academic standards. We still meet academic standards in a play-based environment. We just do it in a developmentally appropriate way. So we're not eliminating instruction. We're giving them instruction experiences that the brain actually grows from. The brain actually makes those connections. So let's start with kindergarten. Let's talk about some of those kinds of activities in a kindergarten program. So let's start with the idea of dramatic play or language and literacy, right? In kindergarten, we're really concerned with the idea of children beginning to learn to read. In standard-based education currently, children are required to read quite a lot and quite well by the end of kindergarten.
Correct.
So what are some play-based ways we can do literacy and language in kindergarten that is appropriate, developmentally appropriate for them, that isn't just them being forced to do something on a handout? One of the great ways to do this is through dramatic play centers. And I'm going to just give you an example. Some dramatic play centers, grocery stores, post offices, classroom libraries. So what are some things that you think we could do with those centers that would help make this connection between language and literacy?
Well, if we're going to have a grocery store, we are going to have things labeled. So we're going to have our food labeled, so the children are going to be able to see the actual words. And they're going to be able to identify different vegetables and that. So they're going to get that kind of literacy where a parent may not see that. So when they take their own child to the store, you're like, okay, go get me my, ragu. They're able to go and pick out the right one because they're able to identify that. So if we're going to go ahead and do that. If we're going to do maybe, you said the grocery store, home living as just a home living, they're going to also mimic what they have at home, and that's going to be their experience, and be able to have a microwave and how to push the buttons, and that this is a pizza and needs to cook for 5 minutes, and they're going to be able to mimic that also on there. That's learning. In dramatic play.
Exactly. And what's happening in the brain at that time is powerful, super powerful. They're using all different kinds of neural connections at the same time. They're learning symbols, right? So symbolic thinking. They're learning social understanding as they interact with each other. They're learning language. Maybe new language. Maybe if you're introducing, say, a post office in dramatic play, they're learning new language. They're learning about different skills that you have to write a letter. How do you write a letter? They're practicing writing a grocery list, or they're pretending to read signs. They don't all read in kindergarten, of course. So they're pretending to read signs. They're pretending to do the things that we're going to want them to do, to understand. And they're building those pathways that are going to support that learning later on, and the reading and writing later on. So letter learning is learned in that kind of environment, right? Because they're learning they're seeing the letters and all of that. Also, if we're introducing them to stories, we're doing read aloud books, or we're doing puppet play, or felt board stories, all of those things, or we're reenacting stories.
Yes. That
gives them a lot. Have you seen those kinds of activities in classrooms?
Yes, the brown bear. The children, they know that, and they're able to, dictate that. And so they're able to also to draw their own pictures of what, they've just heard from, brown bear. So, and that's also done in literacy. And so the children are being exposed to that in school.
We tell the story, right? They hear the story over and over and over, and then they retell the story. And we can put that into, sometimes we do dictation where the kids, before they're able to write, they dictate the story back to us and we write it down. And I've seen teachers that put the book together and put it in their language center, so then the kids can read it, even though they're not really reading it. But it begins to give them the understanding of the written word, which is the beginning of literacy. Yes. The understanding that those symbols that we've all agree sound a certain way, and if you put them together, form certain words, those symbols mean something. They're meaningful. That's what we learn by doing these kinds of activities.
Or even giving the children a picture. And each child has a different version of that picture. So when you're dictating it and, you start out like, oh, Johnny's jumping over, the couch. And somebody else would say, oh no, Johnny's flying over the couch. And so every child's able to give what they see, right, not what I see.
That also uses their own experiences. Children come to us with different experiences, so they've seen different things. They have already some different connections in their brain, so they're able to do that. They also share that with their friends, so there's again that social interaction that happens.
Correct.
The other thing that we do sometimes in a kindergarten environment is learning letters through movement. Like maybe we make the letters with our body, or we make the letters in clay, or in using sand or something like that. And again, that movement activates the brain's motor cortex and strengthens, again, those memories, those connections, those neural connections that then hold on to that. And what sometimes parents and some educators don't understand is those connections are there. That we need to make those connections strong, otherwise they get sloughed away. So if we make those connections strong, they're there. So then when it is developmentally appropriate to start writing or reading or whatever, that the information's there. It's there for us already. We have the ability in our brain to tap into those. It's like if we had it in a file and we filed it away in the file cabinet of our brain, then when it's time to use it, we can pull it out and use it because we have that connection.
Yes. It makes sense. It's like right now in our brains, we can see the different letters. Well, we were exposed to those letters by pictures, by tracing it with our finger, and it's stored. It didn't go away because I got it at a younger age for it to be stored and be able to use when I was ready to use it.
Exactly. So let's move to math,
Okay.
some math ideas in kindergarten that we can use in a classroom. One of the things that we should do in a classroom in math in kindergarten is count real things. You used that earlier with the flower example, right? Counting is really important. Numbers, again, are symbols. So we see the number, say the number 4, we see that. We don't actually immediately understand what that means. Counting gives us the opportunity to understand and to make that neural connection to what does I have this many of something that means for this number that looks like that over here, and then make that connection. So we should give them lots of opportunities to count buttons, blocks, natural materials that are in their environment so that they're seeing that all the time. It helps them to move from the concrete to the abstract. The number 4 is an abstract concept. Counting 4 of something is concrete. And so we need to give them those opportunities. What are some things that you've seen in classrooms, in kindergarten classrooms, where they do these kind of concrete math activities?
They use the dominoes. So the kids are sitting there and they're connecting the dominoes because they do have the dots on them. So we're able to count that. The money, like you said about money, counting out the money, having the children use their finger. You hear children starting to count and maybe to get to 5, and next they jump 7 or 8. And then instead of, oh, no, let's start all over, you just finished counting with them. So we went 5, then like 8, we're like 6, 7. And so that they're able to, catch and really have them use the object to count. Because if not, if you notice, kindergarten children, they start moving their fingers all over,
yes.
So they're not making that connection.
Right.
So having those items to really count and, count those objects out.
Yes.
And then it has that connection.
So one of the things we want to really get across is we need understanding before representation. Understanding is the concrete idea. Representation is the abstract idea. And so that helps us. And again, the idea of movement, counting things as they move, jumping from rock to rock and counting 1, 2, 3, or going upstairs, 1, 2, 3. That movement is a really great way to get these neural connections strong.
Very true. I mean, they can even count for you. As a teacher, you're constantly counting children. Your children start counting themselves, and they tell you, hey, Miss Jeni, I have, you have 12 kids, but so-and-so went home, so now you only have 11.
Right,
and you're like,
exactly.
Are you sure? Let's count. And then, so they're using that number, and you're like, they just subtracted. You're telling the parents, look they just did math.
So after our break, we're going to talk still a little bit about kindergartners. We're going to talk about their executive function. Okay. So let's take a little break.
Okay, great. Enjoying today's episode? Like and rate our episode to support us here at Wired to Play. Do you have a story or a question? Would you like to share it on our show? Email us at wiredtoplay@zayproductions.com and follow us on Instagram at Wired to Play Podcast. And a special thanks to viewers like you. Thank you. Now back to the show.
So we're still talking about kindergarten, and I want to talk about a thing that's really important. A piece of the brain development that's really important is our executive function, that prefrontal cortex in the brain. And how do we prop that up with activities in the kindergarten space? And one of the ways we do that is through classroom jobs that give responsibility. I think that's a really important thing. In fact, I was listening to a book on tape today on my way to work, and one of the things that the author was talking about was how sad it is that we've lost classroom pets in classrooms, because that gave such a great classroom responsibility, because there's a lot that there's a lot of responsibility in taking care of a classroom pet. And one of the things we know is these responsibilities build our prefrontal cortex. They help our executive function, and they help children adjust their behavior. This particular author, she talked about how she had this area in her classroom where kids were running, and it was just an obnoxious area. And she ended up putting the classroom pet, which I think was a toad, in this area. And it automatically fixed the kids' behavior, because they recognized that they needed to slow down because they didn't want to knock the toad's sort of habitat off. And I thought that was really an interesting thing, because you would be afraid to put this big, tank or aquarium, what do they call it, terrarium, whatever, there with a toad in it, that the kids would just dump it over. But they actually got more respectful, and that made a connection for them in their brain.
Because I think sometimes teachers use the class jobs and they give them to the easy children, because they're not going to get distracted and use it. And so I think that's probably one of the reasons why you're not really seeing those class jobs out. But in kindergarten, I love passing out the milk when it was like snack time, and you would go up to the wall and you would check your name to see, what do I get to do today? Right. And I would be like, the milk. And I was like, I'm walking around giving everybody their milk. So having that expectation when you walk into the classroom, knowing like, I get to do something extra, I'm responsible. And then if somebody didn't get their milk, I would run back up to the cart and grab their milk. And I just felt so satisfied.
I'm old enough to remember when they used to give a little nap break in kindergarten, and we used to have this job where you got to be the wake up fairy. And they gave you like a little wand and you got to go around and you got to gently touch your friends on the head. And I remember that too. Oh my gosh, today's my day to be the wake up fairy, and I'm responsible to make sure everybody gets up, because we had to get our shoes put back on and get ready for our parents to pick us up. We were in half day kindergarten or whatever. So I remember that a lot, that the jobs were very meaningful to us, because we really did feel, we were really made to feel like we had responsibility. And the neuroscience backs that up. It shows that helps and supports our executive function, that prefrontal cortex development. That's really important. Another thing in kindergarten or in this age group that's really good is doing collaborative things with them, where they're working together to do something. They're working together to build a project, or they're working together to build blocks, or something like that, or you're using recycled materials to make something. In my daughter's kindergarten class, I remember that they did leprechaun traps, and I remember them coming in, and the teacher put them in groups, and she just gave them a bunch of really just different junk. Then she had them create these leprechaun traps. So they had to really think about the ideas. They had to think about what they wanted to look like. They had to negotiate with each other. There was a lot of executive functioning things happening in that project. So those are the kinds of things we can do that give them meaningful ways to develop their brain, as opposed to just looking at a leprechaun trap on a handout.
Correct. Yeah, and also teaching the children about sharing. Like, it's your turn now, what's your idea, right? Because before going into kindergarten, you had a lot of children where they are having the arguments. It's mine, it's my turn, it's not. Here it's like, well, let's share. One of the activities that we do at the school is they have to share crayons. Like you put a rubber band around the crayons, and the children share those crayons, and they're moving it together and making that design. And without one or the other,
those are great.
They're not going to have that art activity. And so that's a great activity of working together and feeling satisfied, like we made that together.
Those kinds of activities build attention, they build working memory, and they build self-regulation in the kids. All of those are precursors of this executive function that we're speaking of. So let's talk a little bit about first grade now, right? In first grade, we think about this idea that, again, we've moved into, we start moving into real school in kindergarten, real school, right? I always say that with the quotation marks. But first grade, we start to think about kids sitting more at desks, having to focus on writing and doing things. And I would argue that these kids still need play. They still need to learn in a hands-on way. They're still concrete learners. Even though they're starting to move more towards abstract thinking, they're beginning to understand symbols. They're beginning to understand when they look at the alphabet. They're beginning to understand putting the phonics with it and being able to blend those things together to make words. But they still really are concrete learners. In concrete learning, they still need to touch it and talk through it and see it. That's the important part of concrete learning. So let's start with reading and writing in first grade. One of the things that we do, we know they have to start this idea of reading things, writing things down. So maybe what we do is we do story mapping with them. We let them do drawings, or we let them do something with manipulatives before they write. Mm-hmm. We let them have a conversation with each other to talk through their ideas before they have to write things down. We give them maybe a word bank so they see the words written, because the pressure, we don't want them to have the pressure of the words if they're still learning to write, learning to spell, learning to read. But we can give them this word bank so they can see the words, and then they can write a sentence or two or four or whatever we think they are. And we do this kind of pre-planning with them so they are understanding the concepts in a hands-on way. We give them this sort of interaction because we know language develops with interaction. We learn, I said this in a previous podcast, we learn our entire native language by the time we're 4 or 5. We can speak quite eloquently in our native language. And so we know this relationship component is really important in reading and writing. And so we want to have this idea of that kind of active learning in the process of language and literacy. For example, storytelling. We do a lot of storytelling in preschool, and I think we move away from that some. But I remember when I was in school, I remember our teacher reading to us, picking a class story. Mm-hmm. Have you seen something like that?
I remember it for myself, but now as the older ones, no, it's like silent reading. Their homework at first grade is, go and read for 20 minutes and your parent has a timer on. And then you ask the child, well, what did you read? They don't even know what they read because they're not really taking it in. And it's really sad because being in first grade, I can remember we came in from recess or from lunch and we all sat down and our teacher would start the book and she would read the book and, we would go through the whole chapter and then she would ask questions like, and one person, another students of what they learned from it may not be what, I learned from it.
Exactly.
And, it was interesting books. So even if we had the wiggles, it wasn't a distraction to the teacher. I think that's part of it right now is stop moving in your seat. Go sit down. Why can't you sit down, and having them do that independent reading.
Right. And we need to be able to help children verbalize their ideas before they write.
Yes.
We need to be able to verbalize. We need to be able to say what we want to write before we write it. And reading out loud gives them that opportunity. It gives them opportunity to hear the words in a verbal way, and then for them to be able to translate that into the written word, which is so very important. We know that again, that social interaction of storytelling, collaborative, listening to stories, that social interaction strengthens those neural connections. It helps them understand language, reasoning, and perspective taking. You learn a lot about someone else's perspective when you're hearing a story about them.
Yes.
That's what fostered my love of reading, is I had teachers who showed me reading, who read to me and made me think, oh yeah, I want to be able to do that, because I really loved the stories. I connected with those stories.
You know, right now at our center, we get after school, so we really don't have that academics, but of like sitting down, do your homework, do that. But we do have where they have to do homework time and they have to be silent. And, you know, now thinking about how we, you know, introduce that back into our daycare centers of reading and having the children be involved in that instead of silent reading when they're probably not even grasping anything.
That's right. That's exactly true. That is such an important thing. And so if we move to math, we think about math in this age group, one of the things we want to do is give them real concrete, especially with math, real concrete ways to see math. One of the ways we can do that is real world problems. I have a pizza. I have 5 friends. How are we going to divide that pizza up so that it's even? So we each get the same amount of pieces. Mm-hmm. How are we going to do that? That's a real world problem. What are we going to do when we measure things? I have so many toys that I can play with. How many friends can be here to play with them? Those are real world math problems. Those are real things that children can figure out so that they can understand how to use math concepts. We also give them in this age group games where they have to take turns or problem solve, which is another math thing. Most math is problem solving. And so how do we give them different real world experiences where they're getting math concepts? So I think that's a really important thing. And that, again, helps their reasoning and their executive function. And finally, in this age group, I'd like to just talk about a little bit about science. So when we're looking at science for this age group, we really, really want it to be hands-on. Not that we don't really, really want everything to be hands-on, because we do, but science especially gives us a chance to let kids investigate what's going to happen. That's sort of what scientists do, right? Scientists come up with a hypothesis and then they design some kind of experiment and they see what's going to happen. That's how we should be introducing science to kids, even if we already know what's going to happen. So we plant seeds, we observe insects, we test different materials. We give them these hands-on activities that pique their curiosity and their inquiry. We give them these examples of things, and that helps engage multiple areas of their brain while they're trying to figure it out through this idea of investigation. So, and then we give them ways to translate that, right? We give them science journals where they can either write if they have the ability to write yet, or they can draw pictures. They can draw what they're seeing. They can draw, you know, they can go every day to look at their plant and see how it's drawn. They can do measuring of how tall their plant's gotten. There's so many great hands-on activities that they can do where they can meld literature together with math, with science.
Well, we just did the lima bean in a bag with our school-age children. And, you know, of course, they're being silly. So they really wet the paper towel and they put it in the bag with their lima bean. A couple of days later, they went to go check it out and they like mold. And so their kids were like, oh man, what's going on? So we asked, well, what did you think happened? We're like, why did you think the seed mold? What could have happened? So they were all talking about it, and you know the teacher was all putting down the notes, and so we said, well, let's try it again. Let's try something different. What did we do that is going to be different now?
Problem solving.
They problem solved, and so now they have another window of their lima beans with less water, and they're spouting. And they're seeing the little seed open. And so the kids were going back and they're like, oh, too much water. Yes. So that you basically like drowned your seed. It couldn't grow. And so that was just a great, you know, activity. And that was school-age children. And they were able to really see the difference. Our kindergartners, they have the nice little pots with the holes in it to do the seeding. And then I said, well, here, use some styrofoam cups. And the teacher goes, yeah, let's see what's going to grow faster. Is it going to grow faster with this kind of pot, or is it going to grow faster with the styrofoam cup? No, it's growing faster with the right cup. So, I mean, that is still science.
What a great opportunity for them to really figure that out on their own too. That's a huge opportunity. For if you just said that to them, don't water it so much, your seed's gonna mold. Then the kids would have been like, oh, okay, but do I really even know what that means? But they got to actually see it. And then they got to try it the other way and see that, oh, yes, it did work. It does grow that way. And that's what caused the too much water is what caused the mold. That's a great experience. That's going to make a connection that's never going to go away in their brain. They're going to remember that when they're in their 40s and they're trying to plant seeds, they're going to remember that they can't put too much water.
Don't water it too much.
Right?
It's not going to grow.
Super great. That's a super great thing. So we've come to the end of our time. Unfortunately, we only got through kindergarten and first grade. So please come back again next week where we'll go on and we'll talk about some things that we can see in a second and third grade class, because we really want to remember that brain research says that we should be doing these hands-on activity through age 8. So all the way through third grade, we should be presenting things in a hands-on, concrete way. So next week, we'll talk about second and third grade. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.